My name is Megan O'Boyle, and I want to thank the organizers and sponsors for inviting me here today to share my story, my experiences, lessons learned about data collection. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I ended up in this place. I have a daughter with a rare syndrome called Phelan-McDermid syndrome, and she's now 20. It's a genetic syndrome that is related to autism and epilepsy and some other medical conditions. When she was 10, I was contacted by the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation and asked if I would join some other parent volunteers to start a registry. First, I didn't know what a patient registry was. None of us were experts in data collection or informatics or had ever heard of survey methodology and didn't know what governance was. But nevertheless, we took this on and we did the best that we could. And, for several years, we thought we had, really done an amazing job. And in many ways we did. In retrospect, there are some lessons learned that I will share later in my slides. And the slides will be made available. I also want to just let you know that please put any questions in the chat. It would also be great to know who already has data collection. You can put that in the chat, whether you're a patient group. So let me get started. Go ahead and so hope everybody can see my slides. So I just want to go back to the title of this a little bit. It's collecting and sharing usable patient-reported data on the patient's terms. So the word usable is very significant here, and you'll learn why. And patient's terms is specific to patients, as opposed to a patient disease organization like the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation or Fill in Your Disease organization, or a researcher, institution, or industry partner. So the reason that our foundation decided to collect data in a registry was because everywhere we went, FDA, researchers, other organizations said, you've got to collect data. Unfortunately, at the time, there was not any information on how we were supposed to do that or how we were supposed to pay for it. Now, there's some great resources out there. The NCATS toolkit is a fantastic resource. There's also the Radar, which is also on the NCATS site. And if you can't find those, I'll just send me an email and I'll show you where they are. Some of the things that collecting patient-reported data can do is help you learn more about your disease. So many of our diseases are so small and they've been around for such a short period of time. We don't really know what all the symptoms and phenotypes might be. And so asking questions broadly is helpful. Getting families and patients engaged in research and empowering them to feel like they are part of the process. The more we learn about these diseases, the more that our clinicians can know about these diseases and the researchers. Collecting data can also help you identify cohorts. If there is a subset of patients that have certain symptoms where the others don't, or a subset of patients with certain genetic mutations where others don't. We've also been able to connect families through data collection and enable cross-disease research. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that short, specific surveys are better. And it's always better if you can let the patients or the families go back and finish later, like not have to sit down for a long period of time. And too many questions can really be overwhelming. And we learned that the hard way. We really wanted to learn every possible thing there was about this disease. And so we started with 100 clinical questions and 100 developmental questions, and then we added another 100 more questions for post-puberty. And although our families were very generous with their time and they answered them, they didn't come back annually to answer them. And that meant that this was no longer going to be a longitudinal data collection. And that's really what we were aiming for, something where we saw the progress of the disease and across time. So we also learned that participating in a registry made families and patients feel empowered. They learned about their syndrome or disease, and they felt that they could talk, in a more educated way to the medical professionals who knew nothing or little about the disease. We also realized that families were using this data in a very, real-time way. They were using this data to explain issues to physicians or other caregivers, or get services through the school system. So returning data to the families and the patients, to me, is vital. It's critical. And I think to expect people to spend time answering questions and for them not to see any of the results as later is not the right thing to do. So how do we accomplish what in 2010 other groups said that we could not? Well, we found a vendor, and the data collection platform vendors or registry vendors have changed over the years. So there's all sorts of different ones that charge different prices and have different offerings. It's kind of like buying a car. We definitely didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we looked at other surveys that were being used in the autism and epilepsy area. We went to our researchers and other key opinion leaders and asked if we were asking the right questions. We learned about this thing called institutional review boards, which we did nothing about. And we thankfully got some guidance from some people and got the appropriate documents and processes and policies in place. We beta tested it to make sure it worked, and we marketed it. And as I said before, we returned the data to families. So in retrospect, the platform was great until it was not as great as it had been, and we were having service issues. And we didn't have the funds to address the issues that we were finding. We had compiled a lot of questions, too many, as I said, but they weren't all standardized. In other words, they needed to be structured, which means no fill in the blanks, put in whatever you want. That leads to too much identified data. But in terms of standardization, there's 15 ways to ask the question, when did your child walk independently? And there's 15 different ways of saying the answer. You could answer in months, you can answer in years, you could answer fill in the blank, it could be a drop down. It could be, more broadly on time, late, I don't know. But not all questions and not all sets of answers will yield the data that is useful to researchers and industry and hopefully someday FDA. So that's something that we didn't understand the importance of. We were very wrapped up in this idea that we were a rare disease and we were very different from everyone else. Well, 10 years later, I can tell you that my daughter's syndrome looks like at a minimum 50 other syndromes. And if she were in a room with 50 other kids with 50 other syndromes, without a genetic report, you wouldn't know what she had. The symptoms, the comorbidities are all overlapping, with the exception of one very weird symptom for autism, and that's lymphedema. So yes, we are all rare, but we are not necessarily unique. And so asking the same questions and having them answered in the same way is really vital. As I said 3 times already, I'll say it a fourth, we asked too many questions and we created a burden. And yes, we did go to an IRB, but we didn't set up policies from the very beginning. We did what the IRB required of us, but we as a foundation didn't really think through, who do we want to share this data with? How much should they see? And what can they do with it? Because we didn't know what we didn't know. And like I said, there's resources now that can help organizations, navigate this type of thing. So I told you I'm wearing 2 hats. Today, I'm here as Shannon's mom and a PI or principal investigator for the Phelan-McDermott Syndrome International Registry. But recently, I also put on the hat as patient engagement lead for a new nonprofit called RareX. And the whole purpose of RareX was to remove barriers for rare diseases so that treatments could be found more quickly. And there were a lot of barriers in data collection. So I'll get ready to review those with you, but in a nutshell, I joined RareX because the data collection will be free to all patient organizations that are rare, as well as N of 1 groups or N of 1 diseases. Patients will own and manage the data. Now, this was never an issue for the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation. They've never tried to do anything with my daughter's data that I didn't want them to. It really has been a fantastic partnership. But for some disease organizations and some disease areas, there's multiple organizations, this can get really sticky. And RareX decided that the best way to deal with this was really to put the management and ownership of the data in the hands of the patient. As I said before, the emphasis of structured and standardized data is critical. And RareX will be doing that for all the disease groups that come in. There will be one umbrella IRB. That means each group doesn't have to go out and do their own IRB application, pay the annual fee, and learn to be governance experts. RareX will take care of that. But we will also educate everybody on the importance of governance and what it really means. I also explained that the part about, that there's no issue with there being multiple patient organizations competing over data. The patient manages the data and can say who has access to it. And one of the great things about RareX, and this will be a vital part of my job at RareX, is that we aren't just a technology platform that sets up your questions and walks away. RareX is here to stand by you, hold your hand if you need it, certainly not hover if you don't, and help the disease organizations best communicate to the patients and patient community about why data collection is important. What does choosing who has access to your data really mean? And why continuing to give data every year is so important. Finally, RareX will not be selling data to anyone, not researchers, not industry. That's a barrier that we didn't want to continue. So let me back up a little bit. For those of you who have not collected data, there's a lot of issues with it. One, and this is very common, is that there's data out there on a disease, but it's in different silos. One researcher collected it 5 years ago and it's at his university, and he may or may not be interested anymore, or he may or may not have the grant money anymore, but it's his data and he may choose to share or not share, publish or, so it's a silo. Industry may have done clinical trials and they may be sitting on years of fantastic, rich data. Maybe the drug didn't work, but they've got years of data and it's just sitting there getting dusty. And there may be clinical data from a study, or there may have been a registry that was started years ago and maybe the organization no longer exists, or they lost funding, or the vendor went out of business. So there's the silo issue. Disconnected data in multiple places. The other issue is that data was collected, but it was collected on somebody's laptop and there was no IRB, or it was collected in unstructured ways. And really, an organization is really excited and they go to a researcher and they say, look, we've got 5 years of data. And then the researcher looks at it, or industry looks at it and says, sorry, we've got to start over. What you collected really isn't usable. And that is heartbreaking, especially if any money was spent. And then in many diseases, new diseases are discovered every day. The data just doesn't exist. It's a group of people that are gathered on Facebook, but there's been no data collection. So you can all check out all the official information on rarex.org, but the mission is, enabling gathering and structuring, as I said, and sharing data to scale. And that may not be important to an individual disease group, but RareX really wants there to be cross-disease research. And in order to do that, you need a lot of data. And in order to collect a lot of data, you need to be able to do it in a very quick and efficient way and make it scalable. And RareX is built on technology that will be very scalable. We have space for thousands of disease data collections. So I'm not going to go through everything on this slide again. I can make the slides available. But on the left is patient education. And that's the part where I said, you won't be left out in the cold to learn and communicate with your community on your own. RareX will have an engagement team whose sole purpose is to work with patient organizations. And if there's multiple organizations, we would work with all of them, and patient communities, to how best to get people to understand the importance of data collection, remind them to come back and finish their surveys. What's a great way to get people to come back every year? Do you send an email on their birthday, or should it be around, Seizure Awareness Month? And we can use our experience to help organizations really, I don't want to use the term market, communicate effectively with their community. I've talked a little bit about patient ownership and management of data, standardization, the umbrella IRB, and the fact that it's scalable, so we could create thousands of data collections. And there's another end to this that's fantastic, and it goes back to the word sharing data. A lot of groups have collected data, but it's like it's being hoarded. It hasn't gotten out the door. And, it's not very helpful if it's sitting in a database or on a platform somewhere if nobody's looking at it or analyzing it. So another part of RareX's programs is a federated data collection or data access and analysis program. And there's more information on that on the website, and I can review a little bit of it later in the slides. But this will allow for, as we say, more eyeballs on the data than ever before. And it can be people querying the data that have never heard of this disease or this gene or this syndrome, but in the query that they've done, this particular patient or this group of patients, data comes across to them. And this is where you can have brilliant, cross-disease findings. So some new approaches to data collection. As I said in the beginning, we were very set on, we have a very rare disease and we're different from everyone else. And in retrospect, lots of other groups were having sleep issues and GI issues and communication issues and fine motor and gross motor and epilepsy. It seemed like everything that my daughter was going through, I met hundreds of other people, but they had different diagnoses. So one of the things RareX recognizes is that no matter what your disease, you likely share symptoms or phenotypes with several other diseases. And this is where asking the same questions comes in. So for instance, if we had 1,000 disease groups in RareX and 500 of them had potential epilepsy as symptoms, those 500 groups and all of the patients that come in through them would, if they say yes, they have seizures, they would see the same seizure questions. And you may say, well, maybe our group seizures are different than another disease groups. Well, they might be, but that's where we're asking the right questions and providing the right answer options will get the data that's most important. So how do we find out what's the right questions? Well, there's lots of good ones out there, and there's lots of not so good ones out there. So we will work with what's out there. There's lots of collections of surveys. NIH has the common data elements resources. There's the NIH toolkit, there's the Promise, there's Phoenix, and that's just to name a few. And so when we start working within a domain, for instance, muscular regression, we would find all of the key opinion leaders, not all, we would find key opinion leaders in that area. We would work with whatever institutions at the NIH are working in that disease area, and we would do a landscape analysis and say, what questions and answers, what surveys, what's already out there? And then we would do an analysis, say, are these good? Are these going to get industry and FDA the data they need? And then we have to tweak them, because maybe these are questions that were meant to be asked for adults, and this population is pediatric. And there's also the whole consideration of, is it written at the right reading level? Does somebody need a medical dictionary to understand the question? So all of that will be taken into consideration. And then we work with a survey methodologist, which is a new term to me. I did not know about these very wonderful, important people. And these are people that make sure that what you're looking for in the end is what you will get with the right questions and answers. And as you can imagine, this is a very, it's a heavy lift. And we don't think any one organization should be doing this specifically for their disease. This is, RareX wants to do the heavy lift for everybody else. The other thing is, we don't want to reinvent wheels. Like, we're building something on a phenomenal technology, but if something else already exists, like there's several great, fantastic groups that are collecting electronic medical records for patients, either patient by patient or on behalf of a whole patient organization. Why should we reinvent that wheel? What we'll do is we'll partner with those amazing groups that are doing this, and we'll link things up. So you get, the patient gives their data, maybe there's a portal for the clinicians giving data, and then there's an ability to collect medical records, and all of that is connected through that one patient. I'm going to fly through some of these just because it's more detail than you need today, but I just wanted you to know that we have this, and I can, again, share slides. Please, I meant to remind you, please put your questions in the chat, and if I can't get to them today, then I most certainly will get back to you. I think we've just talked about all of this. The technology that RareX is built on could also connect with data from wearables and biosample collections and apps. So I've actually explained this process. This is the standardization of how we find experts and get the right questions. So data governance. We're actually producing a video on data governance because it's not an easy thing to explain. It's not something groups are told to focus on, and it's not something that most platforms will tell you about. The bottom line is, down in the left-hand corner, for data to be usable, remember back in the title of this talk, data needs to be usable. It has to be collected under an institutional review board. And again, I can help you with that. If you need to collect data somewhere and you're not planning to collect it at RareX, I can give you all sorts of tips. And groups need to think, what can be collected and who can see it and analyze it, and what can it be used for? And this may seem like silly questions, but there's lots of use cases out there of data that was collected for one reason, and a researcher did a study for another reason. And there's also all sorts of ethical issues with that. There's been some, case studies with data that has been abused in the Native American population. So earlier I said, when we did this 10 years ago, we weren't experts in governance. We didn't really know what it was. And we don't think that groups should spend their time becoming experts in governance. You should spend your time supporting your families, raising funding to further research. For researchers, correct data governance allows the data to be usable. And that's of the utmost importance to them. I'm having slide issues, hold on. So this is the part that I get very excited about, which is the service layer. And I talked about this before. We will be an engagement team that will meet the needs of the organization. If you're a sophisticated organization with scientific staff, you probably don't need a whole lot of handholding. If you're a brand new organization, don't have a 501c3, not sure where to find your families, and kind of just a Facebook group at this point, we might be able to help you more. And if you're an N of 1 and just need to collect data, but don't know how to get it in the hands of researchers, of course, we'll help with that. I know groups struggle with, how do we talk to industry? How do we find researchers? And those will all be resources that we will create. That's my favorite part, frankly. So getting back to sharing the data. This federated data sharing and analysis platform allows researchers from around the world who may or may not have ever heard of your disease to query data. There's all sorts of governance involved in that, and the patient has already decided whether that data is available to industry or to researchers or to no one. And the data that can be queried is all been de-identified. So whether it's the data that the patient entered in RareX, or the electronic medical records, or the wearables, or the data from industry that was collected 10 years ago, it's all been de-identified. And you can only imagine, like, if we could get those silos of data that were getting dusty, that are sitting in universities or NIH or industry or disease organizations, and we could connect them to this federated platform, how fantastic it would be to have people just playing around with the data, looking for things that they don't know, finding things that they don't know that they're looking for. So in the remaining minute, I will tell you that if you are looking to collect data, and these slides again are available, then you should really find out who truly owns the data. And I use who has control over the data. I think manage the data. In RareX's situation, the patient decides, they click a box who they want to have access to their data. A patient organization and a researcher and industry, or 1 or 2 or 3 or none. Is the data returned to the patient and the organizations? Returning data, I think, is just, it's a basic. You owe it back to the patient to return the data. Even, it might be aggregated, de-identified, at least they see where their answers compare with others. I know you're sick of hearing the word standardized, but are the surveys standardized? Can the data be accessed at any time? Some platforms may say that you can only access the data quarterly or whatever. Is the data being sold? And if so, is the seller being transparent about it? It is not uncommon for data to be sold, and that's fine. Just, I think that if your data is being sold, that you should be aware of it. And I've covered most of this. Is this free, or is there a fee, and how much is it? Is it something the organization can sustain? I mean, we're all having a hard time raising funds during COVID, so money is at the utmost top of our minds. What are you ready to do this as an organization? So I will say thank you, and we'll hopefully get to see some of the questions in the chat.